The wind howls outside the secluded cabin, nestled deep in the Maine woods. Inside, Margaret, 60s, weary but resolute, sits in her rocking chair, sipping tea. The floorboards creak as the house settles, and the glow from the fireplace dances across the walls. Margaret sets her teacup down, listening. A faint whisper floats in from the dark forest beyond the window. Margaret. She stiffens, her hands gripping the armrests. Slowly she rises and approaches the window. She peers out into the dense woods but sees nothing. The wind carries the whisper again, clearer this time. "It's me. You're James." Margaret's eyes widen. She clutches a locket around her neck, her fingers trembling. "James, is it really you?" The whisper fades, replaced by the sound of rustling leaves. Margaret's breath quickens. She grabs a flashlight and heads toward the front door. The door creaks open and Margaret steps onto the porch. The forest looms ahead, the towering pines swaying in the wind. She hesitates but then steps off the porch, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. "James, where are you?" The whisper returns, now surrounding her. "Margaret, follow me." Margaret's resolve hardens. She ventures deeper into the forest, the trees closing in around her. The whispers grow louder, intertwining with the sound of snapping branches and distant cries. Margaret reaches a clearing. In the center stands an ancient, gnarled tree with a hollow at its base. The whispers emanate from within. "I've been waiting for you." Margaret kneels before the tree, shining her flashlight into the hollow. Inside, something glimmers, a small silver pocket watch. Her breath catches. "Your watch." She reaches inside and retrieves it. As she holds the watch, the whispers grow deafening, and a cold wind blasts through the clearing. Margaret's hair whips around her face as she clutches the watch to her chest. "Come closer." Margaret leans toward the hollow, her face inches from the dark void. Suddenly, a hand, pale and skeletal, lunges out, grabbing her wrist. Margaret screams and tries to pull away, but the hand's grip tightens. "Let me go." From the hollow, a face emerges, distorted, shadowy, and barely recognizable as her late husband, James. "You left me, Margaret. Now you must stay." Margaret struggles, her flashlight dropping to the ground. She grabs a nearby rock and smashes it against the hand. The grip loosens and she falls back, gasping. "You're not James." The figure retreats into the hollow, and the whispers turn into anguished screams. The ground trembles, and the tree begins to bleed dark, viscous sap. Margaret scrambles to her feet and runs back toward the cabin, the screams chasing her. Margaret bursts through the door and locks it behind her. She collapses against the wall, clutching the locket around her neck. The whispers are gone, replaced by an eerie silence. Suddenly, the fireplace roars to life, and the flames dance higher than before. In the flickering light, the shadow of a man appears on the wall. "You can't escape me, Margaret. Not here." Margaret stares in horror as the shadow moves toward her. She grabs a poker from beside the fireplace and brandishes it. "Leave me alone." The shadow stops, and for a moment, all is still. Then the room plunges into darkness. The first rays of sunlight pierce through the trees, illuminating the quiet forest. The cabin stands silent and still, a faint trail of smoke rising from the chimney. Inside, Margaret's rocking chair sways gently, but Margaret is nowhere to be seen. On the table sits the silver pocket watch, its hands frozen at midnight. From deep within the forest, the whispers begin anew. The first time someone saw it, it was the summer of 1985. Billy Givens, who had just turned 13, swore he'd seen a dark figure crouching by the shoreline of Lake Morrow. Of course, no one believed him. After all, Billy was prone to flights of fancy, and the townsfolk of Clyde Falls didn't have much patience for a boy who spent most of his time drawing monsters in the margins of his school notebooks. But Billy wasn't lying. He'd seen it, a long, thin shadow that seemed to stretch and shift unnaturally, like smoke caught in an invisible wind. By the time fall rolled around, Billy wasn't the only one with a story. A fisherman claimed to have heard whispers floating across the still waters early one morning, though he'd been alone on the lake. A jogger spotted ripples moving in the water, despite the air being calm and the sky cloudless. And then there was Sarah Cobb, the town librarian, who'd stumbled out of the woods one evening with her arms scratched to ribbons, muttering about eyes in the dark, before collapsing on the steps of the library. Lake Morrow had always had its share of legends. The old-timers loved to talk about the moonshiners who'd supposedly drowned in its depths during Prohibition, their restless spirits still patrolling the shoreline. There were whispers of disappearances over the years, a camper in '67, a pair of teenagers in '75. But these were just stories. At least that's what most of Clyde Falls told themselves. By October, the shadow had become a full-blown obsession. Kids dared each other to sneak down to the lake at night, though most didn't make it past the first turn in the trail. Local papers ran headlines like "The Haunting of Lake Morrow" and "What Lurks Beneath." Sheriff Don McCreary, who'd been with the force for 30 years and didn't believe in ghosts or lake monsters, reluctantly posted signs warning people to stay away. Not that it helped. If anything, it made the lake even more of a magnet for thrill seekers. That's when the disappearances started again. First, it was a college student from Bangor. She'd been visiting her grandparents and decided to take her dog for a walk by the water. The dog came back. She didn't. Then it was Marcus Weaver, who'd gone down to the lake to fish one afternoon and never came home. His boat washed ashore 2 days later, the seat torn to shreds and the oars missing. The last straw was when Tammy Mills, a sweet-natured preschool teacher, vanished while jogging. Her headphones were found tangled in the reeds by the water's edge, but there was no sign of Tammy herself. By Halloween, the town was in a full-blown panic. People boarded up their windows, locked their doors, and stayed inside after dark. Sheriff McCreary organized a search party to comb the woods and the shoreline, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no clothing, no blood. Just silence and the occasional sound of water lapping against the rocks. And then came the storm. It hit on the night of November 2nd, a vicious nor'easter that tore through Clyde Falls with the fury of a freight train. Trees were uprooted, power lines snapped, and the lake swelled until it overflowed its banks. People huddled in their basements, listening to the wind scream and the rain pound against their roofs. It was during this storm that Billy Givens, now 14 and braver than he had any right to be, decided to go back to Lake Morrow. He didn't tell anyone. He didn't even leave a note. But Billy had been having dreams, nightmares really, about the shadow. He'd seen it standing at the foot of his bed, its long, spindly arms reaching for him, its face a void of nothingness. And in every dream, it whispered the same thing. "Come to the lake." So Billy went. The storm had knocked down the warning signs, and the trail was littered with broken branches and puddles of muddy water. But Billy kept going, his flashlight slicing through the darkness, his heart pounding in his chest. By the time he reached the shoreline, the rain had let up, but the wind was still strong, whipping the surface of the lake into a frenzy of whitecaps. And there it was, the shadow, standing in the water, its elongated form shifting and rippling like black fire. Billy froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shadow raised one hand, if you could call it that, and pointed at him. And that's when Billy realized it wasn't alone. The lake was full of them. Dozens, maybe hundreds of shadows, their dark forms rising from the water like ghosts emerging from the depths. They surrounded Billy. their whispering voices blending into a chorus of incomprehensible words. And as they closed in, Billy understood, too late, that the stories were true. The next morning, the storm was gone. The sun rose over a calm, glassy lake, but Billy Givens was never seen again. His flashlight was found on the shore, its batteries drained, and his sketchbook washed up a week later, its pages filled with frantic drawings of dark, twisted shapes. And the people of Clyde Falls, they stayed away from Lake Morrow after that. The sheriff didn't bother putting the signs back up. He knew they wouldn't make a difference, because once you'd seen the shadows, you never forgot them. And sometimes, if the night is quiet and the wind is just right, you can still hear the whispers. The story begins on a country road, where Ellie Harper's old sedan rattles along a narrow dirt road. The Blackthorn house looms in the distance, a decaying silhouette against a gray sky. Ellie mutters to herself, "God, why did it have to be this place?" She pulls up to the house, which is overgrown with vines, its windows dark and hollow. Stepping out of the car, Ellie gazes up at the house with a mix of dread and resignation. Inside the Blackthorn house, the door creaks loudly as Ellie pushes it open with effort. Dust hangs thick in the air, and her footsteps echo as she moves through the house. The camera lingers on peeling wallpaper, a cracked mirror, and a cobweb-draped chandelier. Softly, Ellie murmurs, "Still the same, just emptier." Her flashlight sweeps across the living room and freezes when the beam lands on a high-backed antique chair by the fireplace, out of place and too pristine compared to the rest of the room. "Where did you come from?" she whispers. Later that night, Ellie is in her childhood bedroom unpacking boxes. The room is small, with faded floral wallpaper. Suddenly, a faint whisper brushes her ears. She freezes, holding her breath, straining to hear. "Ellie?" The voice is barely audible. She spins around, but nothing is there. The whisper fades. Shaking her head, Ellie convinces herself it was nothing. "Just the wind. Old houses make noise. That's all," she mutters. The next morning, Ellie wakes up and notices something in the corner of the room. Her heart drops as she sees the chair from the living room now sitting under the window. Terrified, she whispers, "No, no way." Approaching it cautiously, she reaches out with trembling hands. The wood feels warm, almost pulsing under her fingers. She yanks her hand back and stammers, "What the hell is going on?" Desperate for answers, Ellie visits the library where she sits at a dusty table, flipping through yellowed newspaper clippings. She reads aloud from one article, "The Gray family vanished without a trace." Neighbors reported strange sounds coming from the house, whispering voices like something trapped inside the walls. She uncovers an older article about Ezekiel Blackthorn, the house's original builder. Ezekiel Blackthorn, scholar of the occult, believed the house could contain the voices of the damned. He built it to trap something, she reads. The whispering grows faintly in the background, building as Ellie's breathing quickens. That night, Ellie finds the chair back in the living room by the fireplace. A fire burns, though she hasn't lit it. Shadows stretch unnaturally across the walls, and the whispering becomes a loud, constant presence. A voice emerges from the whispers, taunting her. "Sit, sit and know," it commands. Crying, Ellie shouts, "No! I won't! You can't make me!" The shadows lunge at her, wrapping around her wrists and ankles, dragging her toward the chair. She struggles, screaming as the voice growls, "Sit, and it will all end." Forced into the chair, Ellie's body stiffens, her eyes wide and unblinking. The whispering stops, leaving a heavy silence. Then a low, rumbling laugh fills the room. The story ends a year later, with the Blackthorn house back on the market. A young couple, Lucas and Sarah, stands on the porch with keys in hand, laughing and oblivious to the dark energy emanating from the house. Lucas remarks, Can you believe we got this place for so cheap? It's like something out of a storybook. Sarah adds, it'll be perfect once we fix it up. Inside the living room, they discover the chair by the fireplace. Sarah touches it, smiling. This is beautiful. It has such a presence, she says. As they leave the room, the whispering begins anew. Welcome home, it whispers softly. The scene fades to black.